Welcome back. It's time for chapter 20. We're going to begin adulthood. We're going to find that these three chapters on adulthood are going to take a little longer to get through than the chapters have been on previous eras, and that's because this period is going to cover 40 years of development, ages 25 to 65. So there are a lot of things that we need to talk about, some of which will apply more towards the younger end of the spectrum, some that'll be in the middle of the spectrum, some that'll be towards the end of it. And so just brace yourself that these three chapters are a little longer than previous age brackets have been. We're going to start off with biosocial development. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, let's talk about the brain. Oh, that's engraved printing, so you can't see it very well. What it says is continued pruning. From birth to age 4, we saw this, transient exuberance where all these dendrites and synapses were growing. And in early childhood, we started to see the beginnings of pruning of those connections. But even though we have pruning of connections, what we're seeing is the elaboration of the connections that are being used. So we start to prune back the connections that are irrelevant, and those things continue throughout the lifespan. As into the oldest of age, we'll see that there are dendrites being removed and synapses being removed throughout the lifespan, because that's really going to be representing more and more the exact kinds of experiences that the person has had, rather than the potential of anything that we could represent. And that's why the brain is so exuberant early on. We start to get more and more specifically designed for the kinds of experiences that we have had. So we see early childhood, early adolescence, all this density, and then by late adolescence, it starts to trim down and it starts to become much more organized. Into adulthood, we're going to continue to have more and more organization of the brain, fewer of those extraneous dendrites and synapses, and more of those that are being required for representing the world as we've experienced it. So we have the continued pruning. We see that plasticity continues, but it's getting less and less evident. So in childhood, the brain is much more flexible. If you have damage to a local region in a child's brain, there's a great likelihood that the remaining healthy parts of the brain will take over the functions that had been present in the damaged part of the brain. Not, if memories were stored in that area, those memories are going to get lost. But if instead it's a language center, or it's a motor control area, or one of your sensory areas, whether it's vision or touch or audition or hearing, the brain will usually in a child work around those problems. That becomes less and less likely with age, but we still have very plastic brains. When I was in school in the dark ages, as I like to call it, right? We thought that when you reached full maturity, that the brain didn't grow any more neurons, and that if you were to have damage to something hardwired like language or one of your sensory areas or something, that you would just have to learn strategies to compensate for the loss of that brain area, but the brain wouldn't really wire itself back up at all. And now we know that that's actually false, that the brain does continue to grow connections. The brain does grow new neurons, especially in certain areas of the brain. And so we now know that there's a lot more plasticity to the brain than we used to think. As we continue to mature in adulthood, we'll see that the brain has more and more specialized areas of function. In childhood, there was a lot more sort of just using different areas of the brain being marshaled to deal with whatever cognitive challenge the person is facing. In adulthood, we really start to see this very specific organization of the brain where, for example, the frontal lobe, which is colored in peach, handles motor control. I think you guys can see my arrow when I do that. Motor control is this very last ridge of apricot at the very back of the frontal lobe. So you've got motor control in the frontal lobe. You've got the prefrontal cortex, which is way up here in the very front, that handles problem solving of all sorts of different kinds. It could be interpersonal problems. It could be mathematical problems. It could be any kind of, riddles. These kinds of things happen to be handled mostly in the prefrontal cortex. Broca's area, which is the speech production, is much closer over here to the motor strip, and that's because Broca's area sends messages to the part of the motor strip that controls your mouth, your tongue, your vocal cords, stuff like that. So the frontal lobe gets more and more specialized and has these areas that are dedicated to these different tasks. The kind of lavender temporal lobe on the sides, and of course, remember you have frontal lobes. You have two frontal lobes, one on either side of your brain, two temporal lobes, one on either side, and so on. The temporal lobe is where your hearing is processed. It's right up here at the top part of the temporal lobe, right before it turns into that blue area. It also contains Wernicke's area, which is going to take spoken language and convert it into spoken sounds. And if they are language sounds, they will be converted into comprehensible words that you can understand. And then we have information retrieval and things like that happening in the temporal lobe. The beginnings of memory will happen in the temporal lobe. Up in the blue area, the parietal lobe, that's where this ridge that's right before the peach part, right, is touch sensations. So you've got on the one side of that deep groove, you've got the motor strip in the orange, and then you've got the sensory strip in the blue. The back of your head handles sight in the green area. And then we've got some brainstem functions down here on the bottom. And so what we see is that as the person ages and becomes fully mature, these parts of the brain really say, okay, these are the things I do. These are my specialties. So as we age, we will have less and less plasticity, because let's say that you have damage to the touch perception area of your parietal lobe. There aren't as many places in your adult brain to move those functions without maybe disrupting where memories might be stored or other things that have been sort of organized over this adult's life. So you have fewer areas that are just open and not being used for anything, and that you could then move your touch perception to, or your vision to, or something like that. So you get less plasticity because of that, but because of this specialization. Hopefully that all makes decent sense. All right, talking about sense. Let's talk about sensory changes. First, we'll talk about vision. So we're talking about, remember, people who are between the ages of 25 and 65. So for the first part of adulthood, we're going to see that most people have good vision. I mean, some people are born nearsighted or farsighted, but most people, the best vision of their life will occur between 25 and 40. But for most people, by the age of 40, they're going to start to display what's called presbyopia. Presby, that little prefix, means old. So flatteringly, that's called old eyes. And it affects most people by about age 40. What that means is that they start to become a little farsighted. So in the normal eye, when you're seeing normally without needing any kind of adjustments or glasses or anything, that plus sign that's in front of the eye will be accommodated by the lens and will be cast in focus on the back of the retina without any kind of assistance, glasses or contact lenses or LASIK surgery or whatever. As we age, the lens gets stiffer, and so the plus sign may not land on the retina in focus. It would have been in focus if it was short of the retina, if only it could have landed behind the retina. When we talk about a person with presbyopia, what we're normally talking about is that the lens has gotten stiff, so it's casting the plus sign back there in a direction that would imply that the eyeball needs to be longer in order to accommodate this lens's casting of the image. So what's landing back there is blurry. And if you've ever known somebody who's beginning to experience presbyopia, they'll be holding things at arm's distance that normally a person would hold closer to their face to read, because if the thing is farther away from their face, then the lens can accommodate better. So that's a really good sign that you're starting to develop presbyopia, is that you're holding things really far away from your face. I knew it was starting to get time for me to get glasses when I was asking my kids. I'm like, can you hold the menu up from across the table so I can read it? Because what was close to my face was blurry. Super frustrating, I've got to tell you. If you have not started experiencing it, it's something to look forward to. Our pupils become less responsive with age also. And so if you've ever had a parent or a grandparent say to you, how can you be reading in that dim light? Don't you need a light on? And you're like, no, I'm fine. For an older person, they need lights on because the pupil doesn't dilate as readily or narrow back down. And in fact, when driving, an older person might experience night blindness briefly if the oncoming traffic flashes their lights in the older person's eyes. Their pupil might stay a little bit dilated for, a few seconds, and that means that their car has traveled thousands of feet and they really can't see that well, right? Or if you enter a bright tunnel after having been driving in the dim on the dim highway, that can be shocking to the older person's pupil, and there's a moment where they're like, wow, I'm really not seeing very well. The pupil is just less responsive, and so you get less light being admitted in when it's kind of dusky, too much light being let in when it's kind of bright. And so they want to wear darker sunglasses, those kinds of things. Hearing, there's that word presby again, that prefix presby, and now this means old ears. Again, by about age 40, you start to see some changes in people's hearing. And here's a comparison of women on the left to men on the right. And what you'll notice is that the drop off in especially certain decibels it's much more dramatic for men than it is for women. Women have a much slower curve to the loss of those different pitches than men do. And for one explanation is that a lot of times men have hobbies or jobs that put them in contact with louder sounds. And so, they work in machine shops more likely than women do, or they work around engines, or they fire weapons, or there's just more opportunity, maybe nail guns, things like that are loud, more opportunity to actually physically damage the ears when in the kinds of professions and hobbies that men pursue. But it also seems to be, honestly, a sex difference where men's hearing just drops off quicker than women's hearing does. And so you'll have this period of time where, a same-aged woman will have way better hearing than her spouse, for example, who will profess that he can still hear just as well as she does, but she actually does have better hearing than him. It's not permanent. Now, I'm going to put this little sound into the playlist so you can enjoy it. I'm not going to try and play it on my on here because I can't hear the sound because I'm old. And so I can't hear the sound, so I won't know if my system's actually picking it up or not. So I'll just put it into the playlist. You can listen to it. And what they find is that there are certain hertz where you get to 18 years old and most people can't hear anything higher than that. Then you get to about 25, and now suddenly something that you heard when you were 18, you can't hear now that you're 25, and it just sort of just goes away. And it's the high-pitched stuff that goes away first. So like 30,000 hertz is, I think, the cutoff for people who are 18. And people who are over 18 largely cannot hear it. I demonstrated this to my children when my son was 16, my daughter was 19. We don't need to know how old I and my husband were, but so I played these sounds, and I started on the lower hertz. And so all of us can hear it. Then we lost my husband. He couldn't hear it because we got to too high of a hertz. Then we lost me because I couldn't hear it. And my daughter kind of laughed. She's like, you can't hear that. Are you serious? You can't hear that. I'm like, no, I don't hear anything. And then she goes, okay, yeah, it's off now. I can't hear it anymore. And then my son's all, I can hear it because he was under 18. And she's like, hold on, you're not hearing anything. And he goes, yes, I am. So it's really like this gradation from 18 to about 25 to about 40 that you start to see these dropping off, really consistently dropping off from 30 hertz to then you can only really hear 25 hertz, then really you can only hear 20 hertz and like that. So it'll be fun if you want to listen to it and see if you can hear the different sounds, and annoy, if you have any younger siblings, it's an annoying sound to them. In fact, in England, they had this sound playing at bus stops with an intention to keep like teenagers from loitering around the bus stop, because it was aversive to the teenagers and the adults couldn't hear it at all. So I'll let you check that out, see if you can hear the sound, and then come on back and we'll pick up with something else. So I'll see you on the other side.